Chapter 1. Gemma shoved the warped window open with the flat heel of her hand. The hinges shrieked in protest, metal grinding louder than the gales outside. Salt-heavy air surged in, stinging her throat and pushing the smell of rust deeper into the tiny flat. Paint chips crumbled out of the frame, scattering like brittle shells across her floorboards. Beyond the window, the horizon rolled with a bruised palette of gray and red, the sea endlessly slamming itself against the seawall. Gulls looped through the air, their wings backlit by the weak glow bleeding from the clouds. Their cries folded into the groan of the building's shutters as if the structure itself were grieving with them. Gemma didn't look out long. She hadn't in years. She turned back to her workbench, a slab of wood buried under scavenged electronics, a sprawl of cables like veins cracking outward. She threaded a coil of copper wire through her fingers, trembling as if she were drawing a string through the eye of some impossible needle. The wire kinked, she smoothed it with her palm and slid it into a corroded input on a radio tuner mangled from salvage. Solder spat, hissing against the warped casing. The heat bit the air with the smell of burned plastic and dust. She coughed and leaned closer anyway. Her world was narrowed to the circuit boards, cracked and yellowing, their lines running like the geography of a country she knew better than her own reflection. The fluorescent bulb that hung above her head flickered again, blue-white one moment, gray the next. Under its fickle light, her face looked waxy, hollowed. On the wall behind her, paper rippled. Dozens of waveform printouts fluttered under the draft from the open window, their clipped corners clattering like dry wings. Each spike and dip was scarred with graphite scribbles, Jonas, scrawled until the lead burrowed through the sheet, not a glitch, underlined 3 times. At a glance, it looked like a shrine built from obsession, paper storms mimicking the static she chased, walls suffocating with proof only she believed in. Her hand reached toward the battered speaker at the center of her desk. The grill was dented from years of abuse, but she cradled it as gently as if it were a throat. Her breath fogged the mesh before her mouth. She twisted the tuner's knob slowly, the corroded teeth grinding as it clicked. Each incremental adjustment exhaled static, harsh, irregular bursts that made her wince and lean closer instead of away. The sound scratched down her nerves like shards dragged across bone. Between bursts, she paused, tense, waiting. Every hiss could be the one. Her jaw clenched, nails whitening against the dial. The machines around her blinked uneven light, LEDs in shades of red and green glowing weakly from their gutted housings. In the dimness, her apartment looked submerged, an aquarium of ghosts humming just at the edge of perception. If she stepped back into the doorway, she might imagine the walls breathing with the rhythm of the storm outside, the whole structure barely containing something larger than itself. She didn't move back, though. She never did. Her pencil scratched across a stained notebook on the bench, frantic, listing times, frequencies, impressions greedy for order. Jonas's name dotted page after page, repeated until her wrists smudged black with graphite dust. She stopped only when her eyes lost focus on the words, staring at the name she had written so many times the shapes ceased to hold meaning. Jonas, 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 ink or memory, she wasn't sure which she trusted less. A sharp eruption of static snapped the air. It sounded like a bone-breaking clean. Gemma jerked upright, shoulder stiff, and lunged toward the panel. Her hair whipped forward, hiding half her face as her fingers locked the dial in a death grip. Her fingernails dug crescents into her own palm with the strain. One new sound, a breakthrough maybe. Her muscles screamed as if holding that instant could force the world to give him back. Her eyes, restless, snagged on the photo pinned above the desk. Jonas leaned laughing against her shoulder, his hair messy from the wind that day on the pier. The edges had curled and yellowed, the colors washed into a blur. She reached up, fingertips brushing his smiling cheek, stopping as if she might coax warmth from the paper. She lingered too long, then dropped her hand, eyes narrowing toward the receiver. Salt rain slapped against the window, hammering the glass like gravel as the storm decided to wake in earnest. The hiss of the radio warred with the heavy percussion of water against wood, each sound rising to bleed into the other. Natural storm, manufactured storm, they fused into one shroud of noise that pressed down on her like a weight. Gemma leaned into it, savoring the unnatural conflation, like veins injected full of electricity. Her eyes slid closed, every nerve stretched toward harmony that wasn't there. The more the sound filled her, the less she could tell where the noise ended and her blood began. Midnight deepened unnoticed. Shadows hardened around the room until only the weak stutter of the lamp and the restless pulse of the LEDs gave shape to her space. She sagged into her chair, her back curved and shoulders trembling. Beneath her desk, cables curled around her ankles like coiled snakes, half-dead circuitry clinging and rattling faintly. Gemma's lashes flickered. Her chin dipped toward her collarbone. Still, her head remained bent toward the radio, her ear pressed to the warmth bleeding from the trembling speaker grill. Noise crackled into her, endless as tide. She swayed half asleep, half transfixed, desperate for a thread, terrified of what she might invent to cover the absence. The room exhaled damp air, the storm probed at the window frames, and the speaker hummed against her cheek like a voice trapped in static. Chapter 2. The coastal road cracked beneath Gemma's boots, its tar veins split wide from too many storms and years of salt gnawing at its foundations. Brine coated every surface of the town, from the corroded signposts to the leaning power lines, as if the sea had long ago claimed this place for itself and the people were squatters tolerated only out of pity. The wind whipped hard from the water, tearing her coat open and dragging it sideways. The air stung her lips raw. She pulled the collar higher, but her eyes stayed fixed forward on the jagged silhouette rising at the horizon. The radio tower clawed above the crumbling seafront, skeletal, bent, its one-sprout lattice blackened in streaks where lightning had licked it bare. Every step toward it quickened her pulse. Not fear, something harsher, tighter. A pull in her chest like a hook buried too deep to remove. Rust flakes showered down when the gale threw itself against the tower. They clattered across discarded sheets of corrugated metal, knocking against one another like a rain of coins at a funeral. Black scars mottled the tower's bones where fire had chewed it hollow during that storm, the storm that had taken Jonas. Gemma's throat pinched at the memory, though no tears came. The sea had stolen even that from her long ago. The chain-link fence groaned when she shoved her shoulder into it. The gate sagged open, screeching until the sound broke into a scream that clawed the marrow of her bones. A padlock dangled off the metal, its jaw cut through with a rusted break, swinging like a taunt from the wind. She moved into the yard. Gravel shifted under her boots, snapping sharply as if complaining at her intrusion. From the street beyond, heads lifted. She felt their eyes before she heard them. Two women with canvas shopping bags gripped close to their chests lined to one another with whispers. A man, smoking under a warped shelter overhang, muttered too loudly under his breath, "Ghost lover." Children clung to their mother's coat, yanking her along in a hurry. Footsteps retreated. Gemma pulled her hood lower, though the name slammed against her ribs all the same. Ghost lover, obsession rebranded as mockery. The whole town had found its epithet for her and carved it into the air until it rang every time she crossed a threshold. At the base of the inner fence, Ellen blocked her path. The older woman's back bent with years, but her hand, gnarled and strong, clamped around an umbrella like a weapon. Wind blasted it sideways, almost ripping it free, but she held against it. Her other hand shot forward, seizing Gemma's arm with startling force. "Gemma Chan," Ellen said, her voice shredded by weather and age, but steady with a warning, "that place spits back voices that aren't yours." Gemma stopped breathing. Rain stung the side of her face, streaming into her collar, but she didn't flinch away from the woman's grip. Ellen's eyes carried too much, years of memory, grief, superstition she never shed from her years at the switchboards. The whites had turned yellow, and the irises glistened like storm glass, but they pierced all the same. "It doesn't want you in there," Ellen said, squeezing harder. "Doesn't want any of us." Gemma tore her arm free, the motion sharp, defiant. The sting of Ellen's nails lingered on her skin. "It isn't your place to decide what it wants," she said. Her voice almost cracked but held, thin as piano wire stretched too tight. Ellen's umbrella rattled in the gust. She stood frozen for a beat before letting go of whatever words she had left. Pity creased her face in sharp lines. Mixing with disapproval, she bit back like something sour in her mouth. Gemma turned away before those eyes could pin her down further. Her boots crunched over broken glass scattered across the yard, sharp pops ringing under each step. The storm shoved her toward the shed that leaned precariously at the perimeter, its siding warped and blackened. She pushed through its bent door with her shoulder. The hinges groaned, wood scraping against concrete. Inside, shadow collapsed over her flashlight beam, which stabbed through the dark like a thin spear. Dust motes flurried up the instant her boots sank into cables and wood splinters littering the floor. They floated like ash in the cone of her light. Beneath the damp rot lingered another smell. Metal so old it gave off a faint copper tang, wires long abandoned but still humming faintly, perhaps only in her imagination. Her beam passed over corroded panels bolted against walls, their switches snapped off, wires burst into tangled nests. Machines half swallowed in rust gleamed dully. The hum wasn't imagined, she could feel it in her teeth. Gemma knelt before a half-collapsed cabinet, her knees ground against shards of tile. She pried the door open, rust shrieking in protest. Inside, the guts of long-dead hardware slumped, scorched dials, sockets blackened with smoke, transistors cracked but still pulsing with residual charge. She reached in. Sparks bit at her fingertips, a needle-prick pain that made her hiss and recoil, yet she reached again, slower this time, more careful. One by one, she lifted the remains free, their weight strangely delicate, like holding charred bones. She placed them in her satchel with deliberate care. Each scrap might unlock him. Her jaw locked, teeth grinding, as if clenching could anchor her resolve when the air itself felt alive around her, bearing down heavy like judgment. The storm roared against the shed, rattling bolts in their corroded sockets. Rain hammered on the tin roof, every drop a bullet, then another voice cut through the noise. "Gemma." Her head shot up, the words slamming her harder than the wind. But it hadn't come from the machines. Marta stood in the doorway. Rain sheeted behind her, blurring her into silhouette. Her cheeks glistened with wet hair slicked flat to her skull. Her words came brittle, fractured by the weather. "This is eating you alive," Marta said. Her voice carried both an ache and an accusation. Gemma shoved the satchel strap higher over her shoulder and rose to her feet. Her hair plastered wet across her face, strands sticking to the grit on her cheek. She stepped past Marta without pause, eyes on the shadow of the tower outside. The lattice loomed over them in jagged lines, scarred black, power in its height, even in death. Gemma's gaze locked on it as if it might breathe again. "Do you hear me?" Marta shouted after her, fighting the gale. "It's going to take you too." But Gemma didn't slow. Standing there with the tower backdrop cutting the horizon open, she looked less like a figure walking in the storm, more like something claimed by it long before she realized. Jonas's memory lived in those bones still, humming faint in the metal. She could feel it thrumming through the soles of her boots, low as a promise meant only for her. She lifted her chin into the rain. The storm whipped the wet strands of her hair into her mouth, but she didn't spit them away. Her eyes dilated as though that bent and rusting steel were alive, watching her just as closely as the townspeople watching from their windows. The tower was waiting, and she intended to answer. Chapter 3, Rain struck the windows with a violence that rattled the frame in its rotted sockets. Each sheet of water smeared down the cracked pane until the outside blurred into streaks of gray. The glass quivered with every gust coming off the sea, groaning faintly, as if the storm meant to dislodge the whole building from its stubborn post along the crumbling coast. Inside, Gemma sat hunched at her desk. The single bulb suspended above her swung gently with the wind's pressure, its glow an unreliable metronome. Yellow light for 2 seconds, then flicker, then hollow shadow. The rhythm cast her and her mess of equipment into alternate states of visibility, alive one moment, ghost-like the next. The patched receiver hissed at her, feeding a ceaseless stream of static through its battered speaker. The sound carried more presence than any human voice she had heard in weeks. She adjusted the crooked antenna cobbled from scrap rods bolted to the walls. The structure shifted with a metallic lurch, scraping nails against plaster. Her pliers shook in her hand, the tremor of exhaustion still creeping through her grip no matter how tightly she pressed. She tightened one connection, then another. Each tweak rewarded her not with clarity, but with pain, sharp screeches, and bursts so harsh they felt like they split something behind her eyes. Her body flinched at each sharp pitch, but her face leaned closer, determined. White noise filled every hollow in the room, folding into her bones until she thought her blood had picked up the sound wave itself. The machines scattered across the desk glowed faintly from their indicators. The smell of solder, still lingering from earlier attempts, mingled with damp wood and brine shoved in through her cracked window. Then the static changed. It stuttered no longer the careless sprawl of randomness, but an irregular rhythm, jagged and deliberate. Not words, not yet, but more than noise. The cadence formed an unnatural pulse, rising hard and dropping flat as though breath tried to crawl through static lungs. Gemma stiffened, her gaze narrowing. The red pencil she'd been using slipped forgotten from her lap, clattering onto the floor. Her mouth parted of its own accord, breath slipping shallow. She leaned down so close her lips nearly brushed the battered grill of the old speaker. Breath fogged on the dented mesh, small patches of condensation disappearing as quick as they formed. The rhythm steadied and then a hum. Low, guttural, vibrating across surfaces. The table rattled, pages danced in small movements, charts fluttered on her wall. The sound shaped into fractured edges of syllables. J-M-A, her name, broken but present. The room vibrated faintly with the distortion. Waveform charts tacked against the opposite wall shivered loose and tore at their pins, flapping with the sound in imperfect unison. The air held its breath. Gemma's pulse spiked hot in her veins. Her notebook slid from her knees to the floor, graphite scratching against concrete. She knew without doubt the cadence of that name. Those vowels, sharp then softened, she had lived in them for years. She had memorized them to the marrow, transcribed them onto paper, murmured them to herself in empty rooms until her own voice went hoarse. Jonas. Her hands jerked suddenly to the radio. She clamped both palms against its warped sides, grip so tight her nails bent backward against rusted edges. If she held it steady enough, she believed she could trap the sound before it turned again into nothing. Sparks spat against her wrist, snapping like tiny insects. The sour stench of singed metal filled the damp air. Lightning ripped the outside sky apart, jagging from cloud to ocean in a single predatory strike. For that instant of illumination, the room blazed stark white. Every coil of wire, every pinned chart, every scrap of copper glared as though set aflame. For a fraction of a second, Gemma's face was caught aghast. Eyes widened brutally open while her mouth trembled with words swallowed before they formed. She looked like something transfixed at the altar of an electric shrine. Then night rushed back, swallowing her into gloom and static. The voice came again, this time near whole. Gem ma, the vowels stretched, warped by the hiss, not steady but drowned, like someone calling through deep water. Impossible, yes, but the intimacy in it pierced sharper than anything had in years. Her lungs emptied without meaning to, a gasp turned into a half-sob. Tears rolled, salt against skin already salted raw by storm air. She pressed her cheek near the speaker, sliding against the cold metal, closer just to be closer. Jonas, she whispered, the name jagged in her throat. Jonas. Her voice shook, disbelief and desperate need crashing into one. The sound of his voice, fragmented, wrong yet still him, locked talons around her chest from the inside. Thunder cracked full over the building, the walls themselves vibrating with its weight. The crash swallowed her small whisper whole, shaking the glass until the wooden frame shrieked. For one pulsing beat of silence after the roar, it felt as if the storm itself leaned to listen. Static filled the gap. Louder, louder. Her hands trembled visibly now, her knuckles white, bloodless with effort as she locked the box in place. Hair dangled into her eyes, stuck damp to her mouth, but she didn't move to fix it. She stayed still, ear pressed hard against the trembling grill so tightly it burned against her skin. The radio roared with feedback, a wall of broken sound threatening to pry her open from the inside. Sparks cascaded from frayed wire ends, bouncing quick orange light against her walls. Still, she pressed on. Her lips parted again, whispering fragments caught between sob and prayer. Stay, please stay. The reply wasn't words now, only the elongated stretch of his name across static, bending into distortion, bending but recognizably him all the same. Every sound collapsed upward into a climax of chaos, her pulse, the hiss, the howls of the storm. Lightning tore through the sky again, carving the room in violent clarity before black swallowed it back. And there she remained, ear pressed to metal, tear-streaked face illuminated in sudden bursts, eyes wide with a fusion of terror and awe, suspended in light, half human, half claimed by the sound itself. The static swallowed everything else. Jonas had spoken. Chapter 4. Gemma snapped awake in the dim half-light, her neck stiff from the hours bent over the desk. For a second, she thought it was thunder that had startled her, but no, the sound came from the desk itself. The radio was alive again. Its red diode lights flickered erratically, breathing in and out like a weak pulse in a hospital ward. The faint glow reflected across the sheen of her damp cheek. Rain whispered against the cracked panes behind her, pattering in an irregular rhythm. The storm hadn't eased, it had simply shifted into something steadier, more resolved, as though joining forces with the sound of the machine. Each drop struck in counterpoint to the sharp, juddering bursts of static. The speaker hissed, crackled, and then broke apart into syllables. Restore, the voice clawed its way through the jagged noise, fighting to be heard. The word itself shook, stretched, a syllable pulled taut on the verge of breaking. The circuit, the pitch didn't belong to her world anymore. It bent in strange, alien directions, tones clashing against themselves, like 10 mouths forcing one word through the same throat. The sound hit the copper wires and sent them trembling. The vibration ran along the table into her bones. Gemma pressed closer, her heart slamming against her ribs. Jonas. She didn't say it out loud, not yet. She couldn't risk breaking the fragile membrane between noise and voice. Instead, she reached for the pencil already balanced on the edge of her notebook, its pages scattered with waves and half-solved equations. She pressed the lead so hard the first line scored deep into the paper, circles, concentric rings. She sketched the tower in its ideal shape, not the bent ruin it was now. Spires of signal drawn across frequency bands she had only guessed at before. The words from the static repeated, distorted but unwavering. Restore the circuit. Raise store. Her hand shook. Graphite cracked under her grip, the pencil splitting at the tip. A jagged line stabbed across the page, but she didn't care. She only flipped to another sheet, pressing harder, dragging the graphite like it was a stake pinning the unpredictable to the page. The wall above her desk sagged under layers of old charts and notes, each one pinned, crossed, redrawn. She tore at them now with her penknife, shredding through months of diagrams. Paper fluttered to the floor in torn curls. She slammed new sketches in place, stabbing pins into plaster, layering paper upon paper until the wall transformed into a mosaic of circuit trails and spectral arcs. It looked less like engineering and more like a cathedral ceiling mapped to sound. Restore the circuit, she muttered, repeating the broken command aloud, her voice low but hungry. Restore the circuit. She tried it again, whispering with reverence, then with urgency. Each time, the words crawled off her tongue differently. Soon she wasn't sure whether she was answering Jonas or simply reciting a prayer to no one. The light bulbs dimmed suddenly until the room barely glowed. Jonas's voice surged louder, distortion climbing until the pitch rattled loose screws. the radio lurched toward the edge of the desk, juddering as if something inside it fought to push its way out. Gemma's hands seized the box, steadying it, her palms pressed flat against its battered casing, holding it to her chest like she might crush her sternum trying to keep it alive. Sparks spat from the cords in sharp flares, singeing the ends of her sleeves. "I've got you," she murmured, though her throat tightened, though sweat gathered at her forehead despite the chill gnawing at the floorboards. Every inhale filled her with metal and heat. Every exhale fogged the cracked window until drops streamed down in cold contrast. The building groaned around her. The draft sighed through loose joints in the wood. Machines hummed a disharmonic chord that merged with the moan of wind outside, creating a resonance so deep she swore her teeth vibrated. The walls themselves seemed thinner now, like only pressure kept them upright. Her trembling hand groped across the desk for her pens and ruler. She drew firmer lines on the schematics, no longer sloppy strokes but rigid shapes laid with obsessive precision. She inked arrows, labeled coils, traced every imagined pathway between one node and another. The marks were frantic yet faithful, her handwriting trembling so hard a loop wavered into jagged script. Still she continued until she circled one central loop, pressing the paper close to her chest. "Doorway," she whispered. Her lips brushed the word onto the page like sealing it with breath. The radio screamed in return. The sound fractured open into layers. Single Jonas no longer. Cries ripped through the feed. Scraps of laughter, ragged sobs, a voice quoting news half cut to nothing, someone shrieking hard syllables Gemma didn't recognize. A whole cathedral of voices bleeding against one another through the same torn opening. Gemma slammed her palm against the dials, wrenching them past their limits until metal clicked, trying to carve back to that one frequency she could still trust. The voices juddered in and out, cut off mid-cry, chopped and swallowed by static. Finally, Jonas's voice cut sharp enough to silence them for a beat. "Love isn't finished." Her breath stopped like something had been torn clean from her chest. Love, central, unfractured, warm. That word landed as if no distortion had ever touched it. Too human, too simple to deny. Her knees gave and she fell backward into the chair. The lamp hung crooked, casting veins of pale shadows across the wall-circuit shrine. Her satchel lay against the chair's leg, half open, wires spilling like entrails across the floor and coiling around her boots. They reached expectantly toward the desk, their tips glinting tiny flashes whenever the diode lights flickered again, umbilical cords feeding a thing that was no longer just machinery. She stared at the trembling radio, its glow beating erratic on and off as if mirroring Jonas's scattered pulse. Her lips parted, soft, torn almost to air itself, the whisper cracked free. "Then I'll finish it," the room hummed, machines breathing. Her diagrams surrounded her like scripture plastered to the walls of a ruin. The static pulsed again, carrying in its cadence not just his voice but something vaster trailing behind in fragments. Gemma pressed her hands together on her lap, knuckles white with fevered terror, eyes wet but unblinking. She could still feel his voice in her ribs, and in that moment her wrecked little flat no longer felt like an apartment over a boarded cafe. It felt like an altar, and she was already kneeling. Chapter 5. The concrete floor sweated with salt, and so did she. Gemma's palms slipped against the stripped copper wire as she wrenched it into the terminal, her knees pressed to the grit and rust scattered across the slab like dried blood. The screwdriver slid in her grip, scraped, caught again. Every half-turn sent a small hiss echoing up through the dormant circuitry, as though air leaked from lungs too long sealed. The smell pressed on her harder than the work itself. Ozone, metal bending, sour mold rising from cracks where rain had seeped in. It reminded her of lightning strikes of the night Jonas disappeared. That same metallic tang scratched the edges of her throat, waking instincts to flee even as she forced herself deeper into the machine's corpse. One last torque of the wrist, her knuckles scraped metal. The console answered her. It woke with a groan that staggered through the chamber like something dragged from underwater. Gauges lifted their needles sluggishly, twitched like eyelids jerking open. Knobs pulsed faintly under her light, rolling of their own accord. Then the red indicators blinked. At first faint, stammering irregularly, then settling, pulsing against the walls. Blood-red light beat across rust scars, against fractured tiles, against the corroded bars overhead until the whole room pulsed like it carried someone else's heart. Gemma rocked back onto her heels, eyes widened, breath shallow. The first wave of sound burst from the overhead speaker without warning. Not a voice, not music, just raw static. It slammed into the room, bouncing off iron and concrete until the chamber itself whispered with 1,000 insect legs. The sound scraped against her skin so sharp she felt claws. She flinched, arm wrapping against her body as if to protect it from phantom fingernails. She pressed hard against her flesh with her free hand, half expecting marks when she looked down. The voices followed. They didn't build, they collided. Thin at first, pushed forward in jagged fits. A baby's whimper, wet and brief, broken off before it could turn into crying. Gemma's flashlight beam wavered, catching coils of dust in midair as it cut the space. A woman's gasp shot through the static, chopped clean in half. Behind it came a man's mutter, droning through words too warped to make sense, a sermon delivered on a drowning tongue. Then another voice pushed in, and another. Each new fragment slammed into the others until the air tangled with tongues that never connected. A broken choir spoke in competing tongues, in long syllables left to rot, in scraps of memory vomited into the space. Gemma's lips parted and trembled, her throat strained like she meant to speak back, but no sound left her. The flashlight quivered in her hand. Its beam coughed across a panel, caught the voice boxes overhead, and splintered light through cobweb threads. The dust seethed like ash. Inside the cacophony, something cut sharp, violent. Gemma, Jonas, distorted but cutting through deep, jagged, undeniable. Ignore them, they aren't real. Her lungs pulled hot air in until they burned. They aren't real, Gemma. Focus only on me. The tone fractured, one fragment pleading with her, another commanding closer to a growl. Tender between syllables, then brutal when the syllables broke, as if two versions of his voice, layered imperfectly, fought for dominance. Gemma pressed the flashlight down onto the console, beams sliding upward across rusting girders. "Why?" she shouted back, her voice throat-raw, barely making itself heard. "If it's only you, why do I hear them?" Her words cracked, bounced wildly. By the time they hit the ceiling, static chewed them up and threw them down, swallowed and small. The console groaned as if her defiance itself unsettled it. The lights overhead pitched violent. Another surge of electricity snapped through the tower, making lamps spit and die before forcing them briefly alive again in jerks. Shadows bled across her cheeks, stretching the sockets into hollows. Then it came, a single voice piercing clear, cutting under the rest not in clarity but in pain. "Mama," it warped at the edges but carried humanity no static could hide. The sound stilled her entirely. Gemma froze mid-breath, lips pressing tight. Tears prickled sharp against her lower lashes, though she clenched her teeth, refusing the weight of it. The image formed anyway, child lips split around the smallest word they knew, choked by distortion, lost again to entropic noise. Her lips split under her teeth. She tasted salt and iron. "Don't listen," Jonas's voice surged again, drilling harder, loud as a hammer. "They'll drag you down with them." His clarity strengthened, signal pushing like flame fanned brighter when the other voices weakened. Needles on the meters spiked red. They vibrated so hard she thought they might shatter their glass. The entire console whined, metal teeth grinding against itself. Sparks spat from loose wiring right at her knees, kissing her skin hot through her damp clothes. The acrid sting lifted like smoke. She gripped the console with both hands, slamming her palms down flat, white-knuckled, sweat dripping across her temples. Static clawed the air, crawling into her skull with all their voices, Jonas dominant against the crowd, the others churned but not silenced. They shredded her thoughts between them, leaving space only for fixation. It was happening again, Jonah's hole pulling close. and yet through the hiss and shriek, through the flood, that doubt sharpened its first fang. Because in his voice she heard power grow clearer, not despite the others bleeding in, but because of them. His strength built on their erasure. Every time one voice cut off, like the infant's cry stopped mid-syllable, Jonas rang sharper. She pressed her forehead hard against the cold panel, letting metal cool her skin even as faint current prickled her scalp. She wanted him, wanted Jonas with the same ache in her gut that had hollowed her out every day since he vanished. But for the first time, she could not tell if his call was salvation or just another scream among the rest, rising higher only because it stood on the crushed voices beneath it. Chapter 6. Marta rapped her knuckles against the splintered wood of the apartment door. Each strike echoed hollow and sharp through the narrow hallway, riding the endless groans of the storm outside. Her coat dripped onto the mat, water soaking into the already stained fibers. The damp clung to everything in the building, the smell of mildew threaded with the sharper tang of rust rising out of the cafe below. Static leaked faintly from behind the door, not loud but constant, the low electric purr of something sick that refused to die. Ellen stood beside her, umbrella clutched shut in her hand like a cane she didn't need but couldn't put down. Her knuckles blanched under the pressure, her lips pressed so tight they disappeared against her teeth. She shouldn't be alone up there, Ellen whispered, half to Marta, half to the boards overhead. The wind pushed against the cafe walls until every joint moaned with strain, as though the building sympathized with her. Marta didn't answer. The static under the door seemed louder the longer they stood there, like a mechanical heartbeat magnified and fed through the thin cracks of wood until it filled the space between them. She touched the knob once, harder the second time, then put her shoulder into the door. The hinges shrieked. Inside, heat and sound rushed them. Gemma sat in the center of the wreck, cross-legged on bare floorboards. Around her, papers spread in uneven spirals, curling edges pinned by empty mugs or scraps of hardware. Lines and frequency maps covered everything, pages over pages laid like ritual fragments. The radio at the core of it all pulsed faintly red with each beat, tangled wires leading from it in every direction, draped over her legs, curled across her ankles. Her hair hung wild, unwashed strands plastered to the sweat-damp sides of her face. Shadows deepened the hollows under her eyes. The night had wrung sleep from her days long ago, leaving nothing but sockets painted with fatigue and light so sharp every blink twitched. Gemma, Marta said, the word came harsher than she had meant it. Look at you. Her voice picked up weight, sharper, cutting. She couldn't stop it. This isn't repair, it's obsession. Gemma jolted, snatching the notebook closest to her, holding it tight against her chest as though it were a breastplate. Graphite streaks stained her fingers, some smeared against her shirt. The posture made her look younger, guarded and furious all at once. You don't understand. Her voice cracked into the cluttered air. She pulled tighter around the notebook, eyes gleaming with a wet shine that wasn't entirely tears. Jonas is here. He's not gone. Marta stepped closer, boots tapping against paper heaps scattered across the floor. The air prickled hotter the closer she came. Ellen eased her way farther into the room, soft against the doorway, her umbrella still in hand even as water dripped from its point. Her breath shook on its way out. I was there, Gemma, she said, her voice carrying threadbare weight. The night it fell, the lightning struck the tower, ripped it apart. We dug until morning. We searched every piece of steel, of ash. He was gone. Her eyes glassed as she met Gemma's. We had to let go. You still can too. The word ate into her like a hot wire. Gone. Gemma's face crumpled, lips folding in to keep from trembling. Her chest heaved too fast, breath jagged, almost swallowing her. She shot suddenly to the table, slamming the notebook down so hard mugs rattled and wires shifted. Pages fanned open, sketched waveforms jagged with black pencil lines, scrawled margins marked Jonas's name over and over until it bled indecipherable. Don't tell me gone, she shoved the book with both palms toward them, pages bent. The pencil marks tore fine furrows through the paper. Here, see, here's his voice, here's his time code. He's not gone. You just refuse to hear, Marta's hands clenched without thinking. She reached for Gemma's wrist, seized it, pulling her arm roughly away from the radio's blinking light. Sparks leapt from a bare line where the movement snapped a cable loose. A crackling pop filled the room, a flash sharp as a camera burst, turning both women's faces white for a second. Marta's voice ripped out raw with frustration. This static isn't him, it's your grief, it's eating you alive. The noise behind them swelled higher, as if the machine hated her words. The low hiss climbed into a shriek behind their bodies, wires twitching. Gemma tore free violently. Her voice broke in too, jagged at the edges as tears threatened and fury pressed equal through her lungs. It's him, you won't hear because you don't want to. Her chest rose and fell with a jagged rhythm. He calls for me, not you, not you. She turned from them, almost lunged, throwing her whole body against the radio like she meant to shield a wounded animal. The speaker spit and rumbled beneath her cheek as she pressed it close against her skin, ear pressed so hard she must have felt the metal grate. Marta staggered back a step toward Ellen, the surge of heat and sound too much. Ellen's umbrella tip clicked uncertainly against the floor. Electricity's smell tainted the room, burn, wire, dust. Then the speaker gave one great wrench of sound, a whine piercing so high it drilled behind the ears. It crashed against the walls until the boards themselves quivered. Marta bit off a curse and clamped her palms against her ears. Ellen shook her head wildly as though the sound ran under her skin. Gemma didn't move. Her shoulders fell slack as the whine rattled ceiling to floor. She looked not in pain, but in surrender, every line of her body yielding as though she knelt at an altar. Her mouth parted slightly, eyes shutting as though in bliss, listening to the chaos split her open. Static clawed through the room so violent words couldn't survive in it. The red LEDs strobed brighter and steadier, matching that discordant frequency as if the machine had found its truest language. Marta stared, Ellen stared. The storm outside beat the window, rain in violent rushes. For the first time, it wasn't Gemma that seemed unmoored from the world. It was the two of them, silent, powerless witnesses at the edge of something already too far gone, watching her dissolve into the wine. For Gemma, fractured, trembling, clinging to the speaker as if it were the edge of survival, Jonas's broken voice was closer than life. And the living, standing only steps away, were strangers to her now. Chapter 7, the single lamp bled its yellow light in a shrinking circle, haloing Gemma's face as she sat cross-legged on the tower's corroded floor. Around her, the shadows thickened, steel beams rising into black above like ribs of some fossilized thing. The storm clawed at the roof in constant percussion, a blunt hammering that should have drowned everything else. Yet in the room's hollow core, the static had softened, settling into a pulse low and steady, a heartbeat she thought not hers. Not human, the room itself breathed in rhythm with the noise, as though the tower carried lungs now, the static its pulse filling her veins. She leaned forward, hands on her knees, her eyes locked on the trembling radio set in the middle of her scattered schematics. A crackle built through its teethy hiss, then it parted and Jonas slipped through. Gem ma, not broken syllables this time, not drowned or strangled. The letters dragged with static clinging, but they carried his timbre steady for the first time. Clear enough to rise over the storm hammering steel, her lips parted. The weight left her chest for one fragile beat. Jonas, she whispered back, still terrible with rice, his voice bent on the last word, flickering distortion, but the joke glimmered through. Warm, almost playful, Gemma laughed. Actual sound, not dry air behind her teeth. It startled her, half caught with tears forming sharp in her eyes. The laugh emerged tremulous, breaking midway into a sob. "You'd be surprised," she murmured, pressing the heel of her hand across her face, breath uneven. "I can manage now without burning every pot." She pressed her other hand flat to the radio, palm against the hot grill as if it were his waiting palm. The warmth suffused her face in a way she hadn't thought possible, not the fever of obsession, but something gentler, if only for a breath. The voice carried her back to the smallness of their kitchen, the open blinds, the sound of him mocking her failure with simple meals. The machine hummed lower, then Jonas began to hum along with it. Recognition cut straight beneath her ribs, their song. Off-key now, grain fractured with distortion, but the melodic slope still lingered, the graveside lull they'd once made their own. Without thinking, her throat joined, soft, thin, trembling to keep hold of pitch. Their duet scraped through the noise, half laugh, half mourn. They weren't in unison, but pressed like hands against glass. Each note she sang cracked like the barrier might give way if she pushed hard enough. Her pulse threatened to shatter through her veins. Then the hum drifted, fading into silence, and Gemma broke. Laughter poured through her in small bursts, jagged and uneven, until it cut off into sobs shaking her shoulders. She pressed her hand tighter against the speaker. Tears wouldn't let her see the pages scattered at her feet. "I never stopped," she said between gasps. "I never stopped waiting." The air pulled taut in silence so deep she thought the line had snapped clean away, then faint, warped, but Jonas still. "Neither did I." Electric crackles scattered around his words, like static itself bowed to keep the sentence alive. She shut her eyes and let salt streak her cheeks. She could believe it, then the timbre shifted, low first, then sharp. His voice warped into discord, cutting so jagged the walls shook. "Don't let them listen." It broke across multiple throats, one word whispering, one grinding, one spitting guttural force. A chorus bottled into one body, contorting into Jonas's tone until she couldn't tell where he ended. Her hand ripped off the radio as if it had burned. The meters above the console spiked instantly to red, convulsing violently, needles like bodies flailing. The light from them strobed across her face until her jaw looked carved raw, eyes gouged deeper by black flashing shadow. Dust shook down from the girders. The static beneath his voice shrank, layering itself into threads of whispers. They crawled up her back, not words at first, just the press of syllables, voices hungry to seep into his crack in the frequency. Jonas came again, harder, breaking into fury. You don't trust enough. You let them seep between us." The distortion deepened until the words sounded bent over machinery, half him, half something larger using his throat as tunnel. Rage wrestled with pleading until they became indistinguishable. Gemma stumbled back into cables strewn across the floor, hands gripping the sides of her head as though she could squeeze the sound out through her skull. Her breathing turned ragged. "This isn't you," she whispered, voice fractured into hiccuped gasps. "It's not you, not you." Her eyes darted to the scrawls littering the floor, the towers of paper. She couldn't reconcile them. The man she had kept alive for years in graphite loops, in notebooks filled to the brim with his name, with this voice grinding down into something savage. Her body betrayed her anyway. Her feet carried her forward, back to the console, even as her head shook. Denial piled over dread. Her palms slammed against the grill again, pressing her ear hard against the trembling metal. Heat surged up, the casing trembling under her cheek, her teeth bared with something closer to fury than devotion. "You're still in there," she hissed. The radio spit its answer. Jonas's laugh, not full but caught mid-chest as if spliced from memory, before it broke into a growl pitched so low it rattled her temples. The sounds rode one another, stacked obscene, like a joke torn in half by an animal's jaw. Gemma's hands clamped tighter, skin searing under the metal's hum. Tears soaked her hair flat across her cheek. She whispered again, hoarse, the words more feral resolve than plea. "You're still in there, voice or no voice, man or machine. Ghost or parasite, Jonas, always Jonas. And if believing meant burning, so be it." Chapter 8. The storm had waited for her. Gemma braced herself against the tower's main console, her palms leaving wet prints on the cracked linoleum. Rain dripped steady from her sleeves, broke across her knuckles, fell soundlessly into the mess of wires spidered at her feet. The storm beyond the glassless windows split wide with light every few minutes, blinding white forks carving through the black. Each stroke remade the entire room in violent reversal. Shadows sharp, her profile flared, the machines looking skeletal and alive. Her hands trembled over the dials. They responded, quivering under her touch as if they feared her decision. Static had swollen all evening, a tide rising across the boards and cables, rolling closer with every wrench of her tools. The air hissed with expectation. She twisted the final rusted knob. Sparks burst outward, snapping serpents across the coils at her boots. The heat flashed at her shins. The tower groaned so violently it nearly buckled. The entire skeleton shuddered above her, ribs of steel grinding against bolts long slagged with rust. A hum swelled deep, vibrating through the floor into her spine, too low for her ears but rattling all her cavities until her teeth buzzed. Her scalp lifted, hair pushed vertical under a charge thick and invisible, as though the very weight of gravity had lost interest in her. Then the static parted, not like fading, not like dimming. It tore away, curtains ripped wide, leaving a cavity so stark the silence screamed inside her head. The absence rang, actual ringing, leaving her dizzy and unsteady. And then he spoke inside the gap. Gemma, her name one word clear, steady, heartbreakingly human, not warped or doubled, not dragged under. Jonas as he had been, as if alive, standing inches behind her shoulder. Every channel that ever carried him purified into this one, smooth line, impossibly undistorted. Her breath fractured into a sob and broke into laughter at once, the pressure of both rushing out of her chest until her ribs felt hollow. She staggered back, colliding hard with the console, one trembling hand clamped over her mouth. Tears blurred light into streaks. "Jonas," she gasped. "Oh, Jonas, I'm here," he said, and it was him. His inflection, his laugh buried under words, the way he let vowels pull long. It cracked her chest open to hear it. He coaxed her closer, gentle, playful even. "Now do you believe me? Listen. Who else would remember our first kiss on the pier, when you nearly shoved me into the water?" Gemma's laugh shook, breaking every third sound with sobs leaking into it. She pressed both palms against the radio speaker this time, clutching it flat like an organ she might rip out and cradle. Heat radiated through the dented metal into her shaking skin. "You couldn't whistle," Jonas continued, teasing softly. "You tried all that summer, never managed a sound, said you'd whistle for me when I came home. Do you remember?" Her nails scraped against the casing. "I never forgot. I missed you," he said, not glitched, raw tenderness, 3 words untouched. Her face collapsed into her palms, tears slipping down her fingers. She whispered it back and shook, as though releasing the dammed-up years all at once. But then it faltered. The next line staggered, hitched, drowned not by static, but by something else. His eye truncated, bones showing through muscle. Behind him rose a wall of sound, screams flooding thick through the same opening he'd used to reach her. Dozens, maybe hundreds, ragged and chaotic. A shriek here, a cough, an entire sentence cleaved mid-syllable. Singing guttural groans, desperate prayers in overlapping accents and dialects too fast to cling to. Even laughter. All colliding at once and snapping away again, like the floor fell through each of them before the words could live. Jonas struggled to keep above them, his line breaking, surging back, his voice only clear when theirs dropped suddenly out as though smothered. "Gemma, listen, I need you to hear me." His tone shifted, frantic, pleading, but unwavering in its truth-seeking. Her own voice cut trembling into the storm. "What is this? What are they?" He hesitated too long, then rushed. "My clarity costs them. Every word I speak steals their ground. Every second another falls away. Their voices are the price." She stood rigid, hand half raised above a dial, unable to move closer or away. "The tower doesn't restore," Jonas continued, softer now as if regret softened distortion's teeth. "It cannibalizes. It took me enlightening. It elevates me by drowning them. To let me rise, they sink deeper. Oblivion swallows them. Gemma, you must understand." Her throat broke harsh. She shook her head wide, hair slapping wet against her jaw. "No." She grabbed at a dial as though she alone might force wires to split open enough to let him through without cost. "We can fix it differently. I can make it stay. I can build a circuit." "Gemma." His voice touched softer, breaking toward tears. "There is no circuit free of this. It's me or them." The truth landed like steel striking bone, one crash inside her chest that would never fade. The voices grew louder, filling the tower with their chorus like broken pipes wailing. The control room shook around her as though 40 storms crushed it at once. Lightning forked into the tower, metal snapping with shrieks. The skeleton beams flashed in stark white, spine of some cosmic beast lighting before her. She staggered back against the machinery, hands pressed hard over her ears, though it did nothing. The screams leaked through her skull, bleeding straight into thought. The console spat sparks, white arcs leaping and dancing across her knees, stinging skin in sizzling kisses. "Tell me it isn't true," she screamed into the receiver, her howl shredded instantly by the chorus pounding over her. Her voice tore ragged, raw, hoarse in one sentence. "Tell me, Jonas, please tell me it isn't." Silence cut her mid-scream. Then his voice, one soft, sorrowful tone, cracked still gentler than any sound in years. "It's me." Or them, the storm outside split again, light detonating through the tower's ribs. For a frozen moment, Gemma stood pale, hollow, hair lifted wild by static, tears flaring on her cheeks. The ghost chorus howled louder in unison, a wall of resistance ringing against Jonas's claim, filling every ounce of space with their torment. Gemma froze between them. Rapture at hearing him alive, terror at the cost, caught in light and scream, static altar remaking her. Her eyes widened in white reflection. Suspended, one figure balanced between salvation and damnation as the storm obliterated the horizon. Chapter 9, salt air pushed through the broken shutters, dampening everything inside the apartment until every surface gleamed faintly and smelled faintly of rot. Gemma knelt on the warped floorboards, spreading Jonas's things carefully across the limited space as though laying relics for an altar. She set his hoodie down first. The fabric still held a muted hint of smoke, embedded deep from nights when he'd fall asleep by the fireplace, insisting he wasn't tired. Its cuffs were frayed, threads splayed and curling like split veins. Beside it, she laid his wristwatch, its glass cracked, hands frozen forever at 2:17. A clock broken not years ago, but in one precise instant caught in lightning. Cassette tapes, their handwritten labels faded, lined up above the hoodie like sacred markers. Road trips, practice reels, recordings from evenings crowded with idle conversation that she'd once thought too mundane to archive and now thought invaluable. She arranged them in a neat, trembling row. She sat back on her heels, her breathing shallow, her chest too tight. The objects looked absurd, occupying a floor already stained with time and weather. Yet here, with the storm churning outside, Gemma saw not clutter but ceremony. Her fingers wavered but found strength. She picked a tape at random and pushed it into the deck. A wheeze of old plastic, a cog catching after years. Then his voice spilled raw into the atmosphere. Warm, unbroken, laughter threaded between words, eased by his terrible sense of humor, a hum clumsy and off-key, collapsing into chuckles when he lost the thread. Gemma's eyes flinched shut and the tears slipped free with no fight in them. The sound carried her back into a single collapsed point in time. Jonas lying limp across the couch, wine glass half empty on the floor, teasing her about her humming, letting the same line repeat until she begged him to stop. Her hand shook violently on the deck's side. She reached for the radio with her other hand. It still hissed, spitting fractured Jonah's syllables through distortion. She twisted the knobs with frantic precision. Screeching layers scissored through, piercing like drilled bone. She lined them, corrected again, corrected, nerves flickering. Finally overlap. For a single breath, his living voice from the cassette and his fractured spectral hum from the radio merged. A fleeting second of harmony, spectral and human pressing against each other. Gemma hunched forward, clutching the edge of the desk until her knuckles blanched, head lowered like she prayed, voice cracking into the noise. "You're still you, you're still in there." She said it again, louder, a plea swallowed in static. On her console, the oscillograph convulsed. Green spikes lashed across its screen, jagged waves flaring up until one line scraped into alignment with the other. She gasped at the sight, near delirious, as though the machine itself had confirmed him. The resonance didn't settle, it bloated, it consumed her room. Feedback swelled, thick as surf-pounding rock. The walls trembled. Furniture tapped and rattled harder and harder, every wooden joint crying in short pain. The single light bulb above her sputtered, pulsing frantic red-yellow, flickering like a heart in fibrillation. The shadows of her hung papers and scrawls jittered against the walls until her notes blurred into one pulsing script no longer legible, only throbbing noise turned visual. Gemma's eyes widened. She whispered his name, but her voice sounded thin, subsumed behind the cavern's growl. Her exhaustion dragged her into it fully. Her chest collapsed harder at each inhale, her pulse throbbing in her temples. She slumped, landing on the cluttered desk, cheek scraping against the graphite-dense piles of diagrams. Machines still roared. Dripped condensation slid down the shutters and met the machines in sparks. Her lashes lowered. The world folded into veils of sound, and she dreamt. Jonas met her whole. He smiled with the warmth she had starved to see. Not static, not fractured. His voice flowed not just in words, but in laughter, full-bodied, carrying air inside it. He reached for her hand, fingers weaving against hers with tactile heat in them. They walked, not ghosts now, not these ruins. Back in their old apartment, blinds crooked as they always were, boards in the floor squealing at the same places. He paced down a hall and she followed, their footsteps sinking into the same rise, same fall. It was Jonas, perfectly in rhythm with her, his hum surrounding them in casual fragments more human than any note she'd forced from machines in months. The air expanded with ordinary peace she thought extinct. She let it fill her ribcage until she could breathe again. But his laugh stretched too long. The sound warped, layers folded over it thickened, the hallway walls peeled. Paint lifted into a spray of static. Wires twined through the seams instead of wood. Brood hum replaced silence. Gemma stared down, floorboards fizzed white, fizz turned to distortion lines. Every surface pixelated, broken into stuttering fragments. Jonas's warm palm went icy against hers. She looked up. His smile broke frame by frame, his laugh dragging into mechanical octave. His eyes glitched. One here, two there, gone, back again, face pieces fracturing into blur. Stay, he tried to say, distorted, but the words spread into harsh buzz, vowels sliced into sharp, identical bursts. She cried out as his hand dissolved into smoke and slipped away. Gemma jerked awake with a gasp so ragged it clawed her lungs raw. Sweat drenched down to her shirt, her hair plastered knotted against her cheeks. Her arms swiped at the air beside her, reaching reflexively for a touch that never lived outside the dream. Empty space answered. The radio still hissed unabated, filling the room like a mockery, spitting syllables disconnected. Near voice mimicking what she had just lost twice. She staggered down onto her knees, fists pressing into the floorboards. Her gaze slid wild across the altar she'd built, his hoodie collapsed limp, clock frozen mute, tapes lined stiff as grave markers. Her hands shot forward. She grabbed at the hoodie, pulled it against her chest, pressed her face into it. Inhaled hard, desperate, just threads, faint smoke barely clinging. She forced its fabric high into her mouth like she might swallow what was left of him whole. Her sobs tore from her with sound unlike anything she allowed alone before. The machines hummed still. Red LEDs pulsing, coils rattling, oscillograph twitching erratically, light overhead blinking insane. They didn't care if she collapsed. They didn't let her rest. They carried wild pulses, filling the room around her as though the house itself wanted to lunge forward into ribs and vein. The glow slicked against her wet cheeks as she crouched among the belongings, and in her eyes sat both terror and profound resolve, fear at what she'd felt slipping further out of truth, and resolve to carve whatever veil stood between them whiter still, no matter what came grasping through. The machines pulsed like arteries. The room lived with false flesh, and Gemma refused to let Jonas's hum sink back into silence. Chapter 10. Marta's hands wrapped tight around the warped metal door frame, her knuckles pale and slick with rainwater dripping from her tired coat. The rusty hinges screamed a raw, dragging sound as she wrenched the door open, scraping it painfully against the concrete floor beneath. The cold seeped in with her, swirling dust and stale air into the cavernous space. Her flashlight cut a sharp beam through the gloom, each particle caught turning to sparks of silver in the humid darkness. Gemma crouched amid a mess of tangled wires, pages scattered beneath her like mad architect's blueprints. She looked up startled, pale as old paper, eyes wild beneath strands of hair stuck to her wet cheeks. In the flickering glow of the flickering oscillograph, the green spikes pulsated like heartbeat monitors gone erratic. "You shouldn't be here," Gemma hissed, voice shaking with a mixture of fear and pleading. "It's not safe," but Marta stepped forward, boots clanging loud against steel girders. The edges of a diagram fluttered beneath her grasp, scrawled lines that looked less like circuitry and more like ancient glyphs for summoning. She shook the page in front of Gemma's frantic eyes. "Do you even hear yourself anymore?" Marta snapped, her voice cutting through the humming chaos. Gemma's fingers trembled as she pointed wildly at the meters spiking up and down, then to the scribbled maps filled with fractured symbols. "It's Jonas," she breathed. "He's there trapped in the static dimension. I can prove it. I just need you to listen." Her words cracked under the weight of desperation. Hope flared red in her eyes, raw and uncertain, but blazing. Marta's expression softened briefly, weighed down by both pity and a sharp fear that gnawed behind her steady exterior. Her shoulders fell slightly. "Gemma," she said quietly, the tone striking like a scalpel, "Jonas is gone. What you're hearing, it's grief, nothing more." A sudden burst from the console cut through the tense silence, a guttural voice emerging from the speaker, warped and venomous. "Get her away from me," it snarled, twisting metallic and rough. "She doesn't believe, she wants you to forget me." Marta froze, her face blanching at the unnatural sound. Gemma reeled back, clutching the radio speaker tighter, eyes swimming with terror and twisted awe. "See," Gemma stammered between shallow breaths. "He's real." Lightning forked across the sky outside, exploding through the skeleton windows in stark white flashes. The control room was bathed in seizures of light, revealing their faces, one carved in disbelief, the other locked to spectral madness. The transmission grew harsh and poisonous, Jonas's tone slashing, jealous and possessive. "You don't need her. Only me, only us." Needles slammed into the red on the console, rattling violently, as if the delicate components might snap at any moment. Static thickened until it roared in waves, overwhelming the rapid rain drumming the tower outside. Then suddenly the speaker erupted. A burst of sparks flew, orange embers scattering through the stale air. Marta staggered back, arm raised instinctively to shield her face. Gemma didn't flinch. Palms blistering where they gripped the hot radio, she held it fast like a lifeline. Her wild eyes, the last flicker between destruction and devotion, burned into the chaos. "He's destroying you," Marta shouted above the noise, voice echoing down twisted steel beams and cracked concrete walls. But Gemma, hair matted to skin, body trembling, was split in two. She lined toward Marta, but her heart was shackled to Jonas's fractured whispers, an unholy tether pulling tighter by the second. Marta's shout tore through the room once more as if it could cut the static itself. The final image burned into sharp contrast. Gemma outlined by electric sparks, caught between salvation and ruin, between the world of flesh and blood standing behind her and a spectral love clawing for dominion at her side. In that fracture, time froze like glass waiting to shatter. Chapter 11, the gale tore across the coast like a living thing angry beyond control. Waves battered the seawall with fists of water, each slam a thunderclap that sent salt spray hurtling into the sky before it crashed back down in sheets. The sky seethed violet above, veins of lightning pulsing like ghost fire across a bruised horizon. Gemma stumbled across the flooded gravel yard, mock rain pelting every inch of her soaked coat. Her boots sank deep into pooling puddles, water slapping heels and toes with each step. The satchel clutched against her chest rattled with tools and coils of wire, promising the last thread to something she could barely touch but refused to lose. Her hair whipped wild across her face, stinging salt in her eyes, her lungs drinking bitter air with ragged gulps. Her mind spun with the storm's roar, a torrent far more chaotic than the ocean's thrash, the storm inside, pushing her forward even as the wind tried to shove her back. The tower loomed ahead, skeletal and scarred, a broken monolith wreathed in electric veins that danced restless across rusted bone. The fractured windows stared black like empty teeth, but lightning flared through, carving the cavernous control room inside into desperate shape. She burst through the splintered door, cold water sluicing down her neck and soaking the back of her shirt. Inside, the faint scent of damp rust and burning circuits wrapped around her. Water dripped steadily from fractured ceiling seams, puddling across cracked linoleum. Where it met frayed wiring, sparks splattered, tiny blossoms of orange fire against the sullen gray. The whole chamber throbbed, a mechanical groan rising beneath her feet like the breath of a beast trapped too long in iron lungs. Her hands trembled but moved on autopilot as she slammed the main breaker into place. The heavy metal lever slid slick under her fingers, slick with rain and sweat. A pulse of electricity exploded across the panels, igniting blinking arrays of crimson lights and humming to life machines long silent. Pain flared as her palms shifted over a jagged, rusted dial. A sharp cut opened, warm blood smearing against cool metal. She barely registered it, tightening the grip and steadying trembling fingers. The overhead speaker screamed without warning, birthing a breaking wave of static that shook the chamber. Voices spilled over one another, layered thick and raw, a torn chorus scraping against Gemma's skin like insects crawling in furrows. A baby's faint, faltering cry, a woman gasping, syllables torn midair, a man muttering sermon fragments slurred into oblivion. The notes tangled, a fractured choir undone, threads twisted tight, chaotic and at odds. Gemma's flashlight beam jittered unevenly, slicing through old dust motes thick as ash. Her lips parted, tongue dry against cracked teeth. She tried to speak, but the sound caught in her throat, stifled behind the swelling ghosts. Then it cut clear, Jonas, something sharp and warm called her name above the clamoring noise. Gemma, just once more let me come through. His voice trembled beneath the weight of the storm outside, pouring through the static like a candle flame fighting to survive a brutal wind. The other voices rose, howl and protest, folding into violent static crashes that pulsed with the lightning's beat. Thunder tore the sky, splitting white-hot teeth across the opening windows, sending lightning bolts to sear the tower's frame. The whole building groaned under the charge, metal singing with vibrating resonance like the bones of some great creature stirring from long death. Gemma staggered forward, torn between fear and hope. Blood dripped from her sliced palm, smearing her jacket elbow and kneeling against the console, fingers clenched brutal on dials that snapped and danced under her touch. Jonas, she gasped, saltwater and tears mixing on her cheek. I can't lose you again. Her voice cracked against the wailing storm, swallowed by the ghost chorus roaring behind him. The control room pulsed violently, the rusted machines rattling as though shaking loose decades of silence. Every wire seemed alive, humming frantic to a presence only she could feel, caught suspended in the shrinking gap between worlds. Her ragged frame was lit by sparks from the console, shadows slashing the walls in jagged patterns while Jonas's voice rose, tearful and tender, threading above the shriek. A single breath held hangs in that moment unbearable and fragile as spun glass. Gemma stood caught between two eternities, the rapturous reunion of what she lost and the horror of what it cost. The storm outside and the voices inside merged to a crescendo that promised neither peace nor escape. Her fingers tightened, pressed into cold metal that burned like grief itself. All of eternity hinged on a single choice. Chapter 12, the console vibrated beneath Gemma's trembling hands as her fingertips slid wet across the slick metal. Her blood smudged damp across corroded dials, glistening where rain dripped steady from her coat's sleeve. Wet strands of hair clung to her cheek, plastered by the storm's cold fury clawing in through broken windows. She fought to steady her breath, but it came ragged and uneven like the pulses flashing out from blinking LEDs around her. The lights flared and died, then flared again, as if unsure whether to stay alive at all. The static roared into a tidal wave, a wall of desperate voices layered high, child sobs twisting into fractured laughter, prayers cut brutally mid-sentence, whispers pressed tight under a rising scream. The sounds poured in, uncaring of walls or glass or flesh. The room itself seemed to press inward with all their longing, every wall vibrating, every bone rattling inside her. Then, through the chaos, came Jonas. His voice cut clear, warm beyond reason, folding gently over the storm's roar. Gemma, the word held the weight of every fear and every hope, spoken with the cadence she remembered from their small apartment nights. So close it froze her, made her body shudder on the brink of collapse, caught between joy and terror. She leaned forward, lips hovering just above the microphone's cold mesh. The surface rippled faintly, warped like a worn mirror reflecting back her haunted face. Rain and sweat merged on her temples, cold beads traveling slow rivers down her skin. Tear tracks gleamed on her jaw where the salt burned raw. Every dial quivered as if alive. Needles slammed hard against their limits, jittering wildly like bodies seized by unseen forces. Sparks spat from exposed wiring, showering her in bursts of glowing orange that made the tower feel like it might combust. The chorus of ghost voices swelled louder still, a rising cacophony of pleading whispers and broken fragments that clawed at her ears and buried into her chest. Stay, save us, let us out. It was unbearable. She gripped the microphone with a tightening hand, the metal slick against her palm, a knife edge threatening to slice through skin and bone alike. The voices pressed everywhere, clawing with desperate hunger that lifted her backward, forced her knees to buckle slightly as though the storm itself reached into her chest to wrench her away. Jonas whispered again, this time wrapped in tenderness and something raw. Just choose me. His voice trembled on the edge of breaking, vulnerable then resolute. I'm here, only me. It flooded her whole being, the impossible lure of reunion dangling just beyond shattered certainty. Her free hand gripped the largest dial at the console, a patched-up relic that trembled with rust and age. Knuckles went white, nails bent and bloodied against its cracked surface. Her heart hammered against ribs slammed tight with dread. She lowered her head slowly, pressing her forehead against the console as though she could push through every layer of noise and iron and storm to cling to the fragile thread of him. Softly, barely a whisper, she uttered, I can't not like this. A silence curled around the words, her breath caught in the stillness that followed the quiet after every storm, fragile and broken. Then the decision cleaved into the air. Goodbye, the word slipped out so faint it might have been dreamt, but the static swallowed it quickly, absorbed into the storm-riven room until nothing was left but the sensation of air pulled tight. With a final, shuddering movement, Gemma twisted the breaker's lever down with sharp resolve. Every circuit cut. No hum, no buzz. A silence swallowed the tower, which was no silence at all, but absence, a vacuum deeper than night. For the first time since he died, the tower gave up its voices. Her body sank against the cold console, wet tears soaking cheeks streaked with grime and salt. Her shoulders shook in ragged sobs, breaths coming in broken pieces like shattered glass. Outside, the storm had not ceased, but here, in this forsaken room, there was only stillness. No static, no wails, no broken prayers. Jonas had gone, love preserved, not corrupted. The echo of her sobs was the only sound left dancing with the faint drip of water on rust, and somewhere deep inside her, the unbearable weight of loss settled at last. Chapter 13. Thin ribbons of dawn spilled through the shattered windows, streaking gold over the rusted frame and shattered glass like a slow-burning blessing. The wreckage of the tower, battered and twisted, gleamed fragile in the early light, an altar bathed in fragile holiness, as if centuries of storms had finally cleansed it. Gemma Chan lifted her head from the cold console, her face drawn tight and pale, skin stretched thin over shadows bruising her eyes rimmed with exhaustion deeper than sleep could touch. The machines around her stood silent, lifeless husks. Knobs didn't twitch. Lights, once erratic and burning, now went dark. Wires lay slack, wilting in puddles that collected calm and cold on cracked linoleum. For the first time since this obsession began, the room was truly silent. She dragged herself upright, swaying like a tree in weak wind. One bloodied hand braced against the dead panel, muscles trembling with fatigue. Every movement came slow, deliberate, measured, not weakness, but the hollow sense of a body that had emptied itself entirely. Her gaze was steady despite the exhaustion hollowing her out. Outside, the sharp haste of gull cries pierced the silence, a jagged intrusion of life cutting through the void where static had once filled her ears. Her eyes closed for a moment, letting the natural world wrap cold arms around her, wind tearing over gray water, the sharp cry of wings. Breathing deep, she let the ocean intrude where spectral voices once clung. Gemma moved to the heavy door, her hands gripping the swollen wood with slow determination. The corroded hinges groaned a final breath as she pushed it open, and rainwater trickled down the old steps in sluggish rivulets. The dawn light caught her silhouette, softening her worn edges, folding her into the fragile cleansing wash of morning. Boots crunched across gravel slick with storm debris, stones sharp underfoot, bits of shattered glass and twisted wire too small to see caught in the gray mess. Her shoulders hunched beneath the weight of everything she'd lost and everything she refused to surrender. The slow pace carried an undercurrent of purpose, one foot balanced after the other, as if stepping carefully through right and wrong. Ahead at the base of the tower fence, Marta waited, still in her raincoat, umbrella folded tight in her hands. Her face was wordless, carved by years of worry and grief. She didn't call out. Instead, she simply stood, a quiet sentinel sturdy in the aftermath. Gemma met Marta's gaze just beyond the gate. Neither faltered, neither looked away. For the first time, Gemma held her eyes without shame or defensiveness. Something in her glance admitted defeat, but also a fragile release, the unspoken acknowledgement of survival and a subtle breath of peace. Without a word, Marta slipped into step beside her, the loose gravel crunching beneath synchronized boots. The storm-soaked path stretched ahead, soaked and reflective in patchy pools. Their silence was heavy, but not with judgment. It was a weight shared, tragedies met and carried without need for words. The tower rose behind them, cold and still now. No static stirred its shadow. No flicker of light, no fractured voice spilled from its broken ribs. Its silhouette burned faint, burning gold in the washing sun, beautiful and mournful, a monument to boundaries restored. Above, gulls circled, their cries sharp and unyielding in the dawn air. The sea breathed steady, eternal as loss as memory. Gemma tilted her face to the horizon, letting sunlight stroke the bruised skin, warming limbs stiff with grief and resolve. The future, vivacious in its fragility, beckoned forward. She had lost Jonas, yes, but she held something delicate and true, memory untarnished by obsession. There was peace in that. And with dawn washing over her like forgiveness, Gemma Chan stepped out finally into a world that could still be possible.